So we've been embarking on a series called Relationships on the Rocks, and this is a study of some key relationships in the book of Genesis, the first book in the Bible that you come to. And we started out by talking about what good relationships are, what the foundations of those relationships were in the beginning, and then we talked about ways that very quickly our human nature kind of caused things to go awry. And so we're getting into that. Last week, we took a focus on anger. We looked at some possible causes, why we get angry, why we feel that intense emotion, and not all are bad. And we talked about some courses that anger can take. Again, sometimes we can channel anger in a positive direction, and then other times we do it in ways that become very destructive to our lives or other people's lives. It's not wrong to feel angry, but it's wrong to respond by mistreating people. We talked about Cain and his story and his brother Abel's experience and how his anger seems to have been caused by jealousy, perhaps. Maybe it was embarrassment or rejection. God looked at his brother's generous offering and didn't focus so much on his. And maybe that created a lot of these underlying emotions that were responsible for anger. We also looked at how God responds. God sees Cain's face fall, and he knows that there's a desire there to cause harm to his brother. So he does a few great things that we can model in our own lives as well. He invites Cain to name why he's feeling so angry. Why did this anger arise in your heart? He also points out a way that Cain can respond differently, how he can make different choices that really will cause his anger to go away and his resentment in the future. And he urges Cain, hold back. I know you want to cause harm, but resist raging like an animal. Hold back, exercise self-restraint. And Cain doesn't. Cain ignores God's advice. But in the process, God models how we can step in and help people navigate anger, or maybe how we can approach navigating our own anger when it comes up, because this is just a part of the new normal in the way that we experience relationships out of Eden, out of God's paradise and God's presence. So instead of listening to God's wisdom, Cain attacks his brother in anger, and tragically, he kills him. And that sets in motion different consequences. Oftentimes, when we act in anger, we face consequences because we're not thinking clearly in the moment. We're just driven by rage. And so he does things that affect his work, affect his relationship with God, affect his relationship with other humans. And as a result, he just turns away from God and distances himself from God for the remainder of his life, from his parents and from this area close to paradise. And he goes out and he builds a city. Instead of being a wonder like God told him, would result, he says, I want to take things into my own hands. I'm going to build a city and make my own security. And we'll talk more about that next week and how our human tendency sometimes is to, again, create these things that replace what God desires for us to have, but we create our own version of things. And cities were one way that plays out in the early parts of the Bible. So acting in anger instead of stopping and assessing it can really wreck our relationships and our lives, and that was the focus of last week. And today we turn our attention toward a different topic, arresting abuse, and we're going to look at Noah's life and Noah's sons' lives in this. And maybe that's not the typical takeaway that you've gotten from reading about Noah and the flood in the past, but there is a situation toward the end of his story that brings this into reality. And so as we get into this, here's a couple important names and phrases that we're going to encounter just to get a better angle on this. First of all, the names in the Bible oftentimes have significance. The name Noah, it means rested or settled. Think about after the boat lands, if you're familiar with the flood story, and how God kind of rests him in a new land, hopefully filled with less violence, but as we'll see today, not necessarily so. Shem, one of his sons, it means name. If you've heard the name Semitic peoples, Jewish people, some Arab peoples have Semitic roots, and these ultimately are tied back to the name Shem, this particular line of Noah's descendants. His son Ham means hot. It's also the oldest place name for Egypt. And so when you see the name Ham, we should be thinking warm climate, specifically the region of Egypt. And then Japheth or Japheth, his name means expansion or open space. And as the story unfolds in future chapters, his descendants are going to spread out and expand. Also, we find Canaan, who's one of Ham's sons, who plays a part in this story. His name means humiliated or low. So perhaps something's going to happen in the story that causes that name to be sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Final two words, curse. Maybe you've heard that word a lot. In the Bible, really the roots of that have to do with binding or restricting somebody or something in some way. So think about that, binding, restricting. That's what it means to curse someone. And then we come across the phrase, again, it's a cultural phrase, maybe uncomfortable for us even, but the phrase is see the nakedness of. And this is a Hebrew euphemism. A euphemism is like a polite way of saying something. For example, I have to go to the restroom. I mean, I don't right now, but you get the point, right? Restroom. Really? We're going to go to this room and just rest for a minute, right? Maybe sit on a couch, maybe take a nap. No. We're going to do something a little bit more disturbing, but we say the restroom, right? And so this phrase is a polite Hebrew way of saying to have sexual relations with. That's what it really means in their cultural context. And it's a phrase we're going to encounter today and in the context of abuse, so we just need to be aware of that coming into it. So let's go ahead and get into God's Word, Scripture today. We'll be in Genesis 9, the beginning of the chapter, but also verses 18 to 25, looking at, again, Noah and his sons and this experience today. And the first thing we're going to take a look at is exposing excess. And excess sometimes can be tied into abuse in certain ways, and we'll look at that. So it says, God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, and this is after, again, the flood story and the boat lands, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. Have you heard that phrase anywhere else in the Bible so far? Genesis 1 and 2, right? Okay. The fear and terror of you will be in every living creature on the earth, every bird of the sky, every creature that crawls on the ground, and all the fish of the sea. Have you heard those listed that way before? Right, in the creation story, Genesis chapter 1, right? Okay. They are placed under your authority. Every creature that lives and moves will be food for you, as I gave the green plants in the garden. I have given you everything. And so this is meant to give us the idea of Eden 2.0. This is a restart, a reboot for humanity where life is good and abundance is possible, right? Maybe. We'll see. Now we get into verse 18. Noah's sons who came out of the ark were Shem, or name, Ham, or Hot/Egypt. We should be thinking of Egypt here. And Japheth, expansion. Ham was the father of Canaan, which means humiliated. I wonder why that detail is in there. We see all these sons, and then we've got one grandson in the picture. That's interesting. Wonder if that's going to play out anyway. These three were Noah's sons, and from them all the land was scattered. Wonder if in the next few chapters we're going to read anything about people being scattered throughout the world. Maybe. Maybe we'll talk about it next Sunday. And Noah began to be a man of the ground, and he planted a vineyard. So this rich soil, perhaps some of this sediment that's been deposited through this flood experience, the ground is good. And he takes up farming and he plants a vineyard. That's great, right? There's abundance. And Noah finds himself there. He looks around in this environment. It enables him to plant a vineyard. He's probably planting other crops as well, but he's like, we can make this special garden-like vineyard. And you know what? It is fruitful, and there's an opportunity to make an abundance of wine and celebrate, and life is good. And it's interesting because sometimes our environments, even really good environments, or there's other things beyond that. Maybe it's our peers around us. Maybe it's something like a desire to escape reality. Maybe it's dissatisfaction. Maybe it's something good like just curiosity. But sometimes when we have different influences on us, it can encourage some excessive behaviors, or at least give us an opportunity to go that way with our choices. Another thing here, Noah has excessive resources. He's got an abundance of wine, and that could be a great thing. He could throw some parties and some celebrations. He's already offered sacrifices in worship of God and how God has brought him through this catastrophe that has fallen upon the world and back into decreation, and God has brought him through that, and life is now good and it's abundant, and he could channel that in some great ways. Or he could use that wine for some personal, very excessive behaviors. And we'll see which way he goes with it in just a moment. Okay, verse 21. He drank of the wine and became drunk. That's which way he goes with it. And uncovered himself in the middle of his tent. It's not a flattering picture of Noah in this verse. That's how he responds. So he takes his excessive resources and he turns it into some excessive behaviors, and maybe there's some other factors that lead to that as well. So instead of limiting his consumption or maybe celebrating or sharing it with people over time, Noah drinks too much and he puts himself in a vulnerable position. He's passed out without anything on in the middle of his tent. Okay. Now, is Noah at risk? Is he at risk at all in that position? Some people are saying no. A lot of people are saying yeah. Okay. We're going to find out from the story he is at risk, but I guess the question is, why might he be at risk? This is an audience participation question. So if you have any ideas here, why might that situation pose a risk to him? Any thoughts? Lack of awareness, right? Because he is drunk and presumably unconscious, right? He just doesn't have control over his situation. He doesn't even know what's happening. So there's vulnerability and there's risk there. Anything else?
One of his sons can say, look at what Dad's doing. I need to take over as the boss, not him.
You've read ahead in the story, haven't you? Okay. June's like, yeah, one of his sons could do something and like put himself in assertive over his dad. Like, yes, that is correct. It could theoretically could happen, right? Here's the thing about humanity. People in the garden, there was this tree of knowing good and bad, and there was an opportunity for people to resist that and just say, well, let's let God define what good and bad and wisdom is, and we'll follow him. Or there's an opportunity for people to say, I'm going to take that into my own hands, and I'll figure out what good and bad is for myself. And that was a choice that people made, and so that is now reality in humanity. And so one of the reasons why there's risk is that people could go either way with that, right? They could turn to God and his definition of wisdom, or just see what's good and land on the right space, or they could get good and bad mixed up and confused now. And they could make some choices that seem to be good or right in their own eyes, but they're not really good and right, and certainly not good and right for other people. So there's some risk here because of how people are operating independently of God now. So humans are determining good and bad for themselves. There's just no guarantees. Could turn out good, it could turn out very, very bad. But in the original state of creation in the garden, Noah would not be at risk. But now he is. People might take advantage of him in this situation. A couple other observations. Excessive behaviors, and this, you mentioned this a moment ago, because of a lack of awareness, sometimes they can limit a person's ability to protect themselves. Not every excessive behavior, but certain ones do open us up to that, right? Sometimes behaving in certain excessive ways put us into contact with people or places where abuse is more likely to occur. So sometimes excessive behaviors can pose more of a risk in that sense, okay? But when it comes to abuse, there's other factors. There are things beyond human control. And sometimes it's somebody's lack of resources, or their lack of employment, or their lack of education, or their lack of protection that opens them up to being more vulnerable to abuse. Sometimes it's somebody's social insignificance. Society just doesn't care about a certain segment of people, and so they're willing to take advantage of them, or maybe exclude them in different ways. Maybe it's discrimination that could be on a variety of factors: gender, race, some marginalization, quality, or sometimes even disabilities. All those things can increase a person's risk of being abused, especially in our day and age. And so ultimately, when it comes to abuse, it's not something that is a survivor's fault. If something happens to Noah in this state, he put himself in a place of vulnerability, but he's not the one that's committing the abuse. It's somebody else taking advantage of the situation. Let's say Noah was in a position by means totally outside of his control, these things that we've just talked about, and somebody takes advantage of that. It's not Noah's fault. And so when we look at abuse, it's not a survivor's fault, and you shouldn't ever pin that on somebody who has survived abuse. So now we're going to get into what happens in the situation and maybe how we can take steps to make sure abuse doesn't happen, prevent abuse, or even put a stop or end to abuse that we see happening or that we become aware of in our own lives, right? Because it's ultimately about how we can better navigate our relationships in this world in light of this information that we're getting today. So here's what happens. It says, Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father. So that's that euphemistic phrase that we talked about. And there's some possibilities here. Whatever the possibilities, Ham sees an opportunity to take advantage of Dad. Dad's vulnerable. Dad's not aware. If this is a time and we're looking to do something, this is the opportunity. So maybe this is even a little premeditated in Ham's mind, and he just sees an opportunity. So what did Ham do, and why did he do it? That's a question mark for us, and we're going to look at some possibilities. We need to understand a couple of things about ancient culture. There's basically three possibilities that could have happened at this point in time. And we'll step back into the way that the ancient world worked to kind of work out those possibilities. So here's one opportunity. A lot of these cultures are honor-shame cultures, and we talked about that in the book of Corinthians during our last study. Our culture can operate that way, but it's not as much based on honor and shame as other cultures in our world today or other cultures throughout history. And so what might be happening in this culture, this ancient culture, he might be attempting to increase his own honor in the family by drawing attention to his dad's failure. Dad did this thing to shame himself, essentially saying, hey, look what Dad did. Dad's such an idiot, right? And he's going to tell his brothers about this and his family about this. So maybe he's just looking for an opportunity to exalt himself, his reputation in the family, and then push his dad down a couple of rungs in the family and maybe become a little more dominant. Maybe that's what's happening. And I think, honestly, a lot of modern-day Christians, when they read this, that's what they conclude is happening. And it may be. But this doesn't really explain why Noah, toward the end of the story, he's actually going to ask God to put a curse or a bind in some way or restrict in some way Ham's son Canaan. Seems like Ham would be the target here because Ham is the one that's seizing this opportunity and taking advantage of his father. So why would there be attention drawn to Ham's son? Ham's son is not in the picture yet at this point, or at least not in the story. There's another possibility here. And again, to get a little bit of other reference in Scripture for this. Leviticus 20:17. This is a part of God's instructions for Israel as a nation. He says, if there's a man who takes his sister, again, think euphemism here, takes his sister, his father's daughter, or his mother's daughter, so that he sees her nakedness. There's that phrase again. And she sees his nakedness. It's a disgrace, and they shall be cut off from the sight of the sons of their people. So we're talking about an incestuous relationship here, right? It's more than just, takes somebody out or for a walk or whatever, or accidentally does this thing. It's talking about more of an intimate relationship here. And again, that's the euphemistic meaning in their culture. So option 2 is he might be asserting his dominance by sexually abusing his father. That's another unfortunate possibility in the situation. But that still doesn't really explain why Noah is going to desire for Ham's son Canaan to be cursed instead of him, which takes us to option number 3. And as the options go down, they just get more grim. And abuse really is grim. We think about how people are treating people in abusive situations. It is an ugly side of humanity. So here's possibility number 3. And this is fleshed out in Leviticus 18, 1 through 8. And I think that there might actually be a fair amount of grounds for this conclusion, even though it's kind of horrific. It says, then the Lord spoke to Moses, and this is again when God is giving instructions for Israel as a nation, saying, speak to the sons of Israel, people of Israel, and say to them, I'm the Lord your God. You shall not do what is done in the land of Egypt, where you live, nor are you to do what is done in the land of Canaan, where I am bringing you. You shall not walk in their statutes. What's so interesting about those two names? What does Ham mean? It means hot, but it's the name of Egypt. It's also the place name of Egypt, the oldest one that's in hieroglyphics. Canaan. I wonder where we've heard that name in the Bible before. That's Ham's son, isn't it? So what kind of things did they do down in the land of Egypt where Ham's descendants according to the Bible narrative, populated? Or what do they do where Canaan's sons landed? What is it that we should really avoid? Verse 6, it continues. It says, none of you shall approach any blood relative of his to uncover nakedness. There's that phrase again. Talking about more than just something visual. We're talking about an act, a sexual act of some sort. Right? He says, I'm the Lord. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your father. That's a starkly familiar phrase. That is the nakedness of your mother. She is your mother. So that phrase, uncover the nakedness of your father, it's related to doing something to abuse a mother, right? You are not to uncover her nakedness. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your father's wife. It is your father's nakedness. So that phrase is equated with the individual, but also with the individual's spouse. So option 3 here, he might be announcing himself as the new head of the family by sleeping with Noah's wife, whether it's his mom or stepmom, to produce a new family heir. That's also a possibility. Leah's son does it. David's son does it later in the Old Testament, and this is a real thing that people did to try to assert their authority and dominance as the alpha male in a family. And that might actually explain why Noah desires for Ham's son Canaan to be cursed, because perhaps that son, that child, is produced as a result of this relationship, potentially. Now, we don't know which option is correct, beyond a shadow of a doubt. Either way, Ham commits abuse. And so abuse is certain regardless of how it happens. Here's a quick running definition. It's actually 3 or 4. What is abuse? To misuse someone or something for a bad or selfish purpose. We could define it that way. To treat a person with cruelty or violence might be a definition. Using our behavior, our influence, or our privilege to cause harm or exert power over another person. Taking advantage of the vulnerable state of another person. All those are ways that we could define out abuse. Here it says, and Ham reported to his 2 brothers outside. So he doesn't just commit whatever form of abuse he commits. He goes and he talks about it. He wants his brothers to know what's happened. He brags about abusing his father or potentially his father's wife. We don't know, right? Which seems to be tragic. Why would he do something like that? Why would you abuse someone and then brag about it? What would cause someone to do that? What do you think?
Maybe he wants to put fear in their hearts.
Oh, maybe he wants to put fear in their hearts. That's interesting, isn't it? And I think that's a very realistic possibility. And sometimes when people abuse others, they share it so that other people realize, oh, like, don't mess with me. Exactly, yeah. And we can see this with Lamech earlier in Genesis. We didn't talk about his story, but he kills someone, and then he kills a young boy as well for insulting him. And then he goes to his 2 wives, and he says, I killed those people. Don't mess with me, right? Which means you better do exactly what I say. And it's another way of asserting power and control over people, right? So that's a possibility. I mean, other possibilities might be, again, because he wants to assert his dominance in the family, or just because he's a perverted creep and wants to talk about what he did. Like, we don't know. But I think what was mentioned first here, what was shared about putting the family on notice and saying, let me do what I want to do, because if not, you'll be the next victim, is probably a very realistic possibility. Brings up another question. How should we respond if we become aware of abuse? And again, this is something where it's the abuser who's reporting. And sometimes it's an abuser who's reporting, and sometimes it's the survivor of abuse who's coming to us and saying, I was abused in this way. So what if we're in the position of the brothers here? What do? What are some possible courses of action if somebody shares that they've been abused, or maybe they've abused someone with us? What might be some possible next steps for us? What are some options? What could we do in response? What do you think? Yes?
Tell Dad what happened.
Okay, yeah, like in this scenario, we could step in and tell Dad, you were unaware, but do you know what happened here? And I think this story doesn't tell us. It leaves some gaps, but I think we know that Noah finds out. And that would be the most logical way, Someone tells him. It's either a spouse or it's his sons who tell him. And that's I think a very valid possibility. So perhaps it's if we become aware of something and someone is unaware that they were harmed or abused, we tell that person, this is what happened, right? What are some other ways we might respond? Right. Yeah, in this day and age, we do need to tell the police. And I've been in that position as a pastor because I'm someone who's required by law to report situations of abuse. And that hasn't happened a lot, but there have been a few times where I've been in a situation where I had to call the local law enforcement and say, I'm aware of this situation where this person or this child is being abused, and so that puts the ball in their court. And sometimes it just establishes, a point of information. Like we're building a case, and we have, one example or one report of something happening. And then if more and more things are reported, it gives them more grounds to move forward, right? But we do have a legal obligation in our society in many cases to report abuse. And perhaps even if you're not legally obligated, maybe there is a moral obligation to report that, as well. So that's another real side of things in our world. Yeah. And I mean, there are some not so great options as well. Like we could just ignore it, or we could even support it and say, oh, that's crazy. Yeah. Go along with it, right? Or enable it. And as we were looking at the church in ancient Corinth, they felt like the most loving thing to do was to continue to have mercy on and to enable an abuser in their church. And Paul had to come up and say, no, that's not acceptable. When someone's being abused in a church or someone's dividing a church, you have to step in and do something, right? You can't allow that to continue. But they thought the most loving thing for me to do is just overlook this and be forgiving, And in situations of abuse, we find out that's not a good course of action. So how do Ham's brothers respond? The next couple of verses tell us. Then Shem and Japheth took a cloak and placed it over both their shoulders and walked backwards. They covered their father's nakedness. Their faces were turned away, and they did not see their father naked. So first of all, they realized this guy, he's not aware of anything, so we just need to do something to restore his honor, and that was the next logical step for them. And Noah awoke from his wine, and he knew what his younger son had done to him. Again, we don't know how, we don't know the details exactly of what, but he became aware of this abuse that was perpetuated, right? So his brothers, ultimately, they put an end to the abuse, and they find ways to restore their father's honor. They're not going to cave in. They're not going to bow to Ham's threats, and say, well, okay, we don't want to cross his path. And they're not going to let him have another step up of influence in the family. They're going to step in, and they're going to make dad aware of what happened here. And they might, again, be the ones that actually inform him after he wakes up of what happens. This takes us back to the first part of Genesis as well, how God created one human to be another human's helper, or actually the word is more like strong ally. And so they become strong allies of their dad here, instead of someone who's going to misuse or mistreat their dad like their brother did. And I put here, survivors of abuse need strong allies. This is something that's true. And maybe you are a survivor of abuse and you have some, or maybe you're in need of some, even now. And I have a resource that I want to connect you with at the end of our message here today as well to help us move forward from here. We talked about the Corinthians already, but here's how the story ends. Noah said Canaan is cursed. Again, why Canaan? He will be the lowest of slaves to his brothers. So he just skips over Ham, who you would think that's where this would be directed. So he's asking for God to bind or limit, not Ham here, or not just Ham, but Ham's son, Canaan, in some way. Restrict Canaan from having influence over the other sons and their descendants here in the family. Again, and that causes us to wonder all kinds of things, like why is Canaan the focus and what exactly happened? What type of abuse actually occurred here? And why doesn't Noah mention any of Ham's other sons? Because Canaan is the youngest of four. And so, again, just create some curious questions. Might be a more sinister reason than we originally thought when we approached this story in the Bible. But there is this violent act of abuse that occurs. to try to take advantage of the family situation, or so it seems. So what can we learn? Because ultimately we're coming to these stories not just to learn about facts and details, but to look at our own relationships and learn from them so that we don't get caught up in the different storms that hit us in life, right? So our relationships don't get wrecked the way that some of these relationships get wrecked that we read about in the early pages of the Bible. So what can we learn to better navigate relationships and avoid harming people? Here's a few thoughts. One, being generous with our resources can limit opportunities to misuse excess. If Noah would have figured out other ways to take that vineyard and all those grapes and channel it in positive ways, that could have prevented some of the problems. Also, avoiding excessive behaviors. They can reduce, but not eliminate, because there are factors that are beyond our control that pose risk of us being abused. So we can never take that risk down to zero. But maybe there's certain things we can do to reduce our risk. And certainly him avoiding drinking to the point of being drunk and passed out in his tent could have potentially prevented this situation. Although perhaps Ham would have found another opportunity to take advantage of his father just later on in a different way. 3, anyone can be targeted by an abusive person. This is an older father figure, right? And I've heard too, statistically, a lot of abuse happens within the realm of relatives, family relationships, close friendships, which is tragic. But anybody can be targeted. It can be a young child, it can be older man or woman, anyone in between, either gender, all those things. Nobody's completely without risk. Abuse is never a survivor's fault. And so if you find out that someone has been victimized by an abuser, then an abusive person, then do not ever blame that person. Oh, if you wouldn't have done this, then you wouldn't have been abused. People could have said that to Noah, right? If you wouldn't have had too much to drink, this is all your fault, but it wasn't. It was Ham's fault. Anytime we use our power to harm, control, or take advantage of someone else, we are committing a form of abuse. And so let's just understand that. And maybe we have categories, and maybe we think, well, this isn't that serious. But that's what abuse is, kind of at its root definition. We can use our power to stop and report abuse. And I would say here in the United States, we do have some power because of what was mentioned earlier about even reporting abuse. There may be some cultures where people would just look the other way, and even law enforcement would look the other way. But here in the United States, for the most part, law enforcement here locally has been very receptive and very responsive to those types of things. They care deeply about the people in our community. And so we can use our power to do that, or if we have power to stop something. Maybe it's something we hear about on the job, and you're in a position of being a supervisor, and so you can step in and you can prevent stuff because you have a position to do that. That's a great thing to do if you have that power or that position to do so. We can become strong allies of abuse survivors by listening and speaking and acting in ways that will protect them from further abuse and help restore their honor. And that's a loaded thing. We haven't defined that. So I want to point you toward a resource. Okay, we have a wonderful resource right here in our own church community. Her name is Carly Cleveland, and her husband Mason is highly involved in this as well. But they started a nonprofit. It's called the Real Truth Ministries, and their website is listed below, therealtruthministries.com. But their ministry is focused on, their nonprofit is focused on fighting against abuse, preventing abuse, and also helping survivors of abuse. And so if you want a lot of resources how you can become involved in helping people who have been abused or helping to prevent abuse, you can start at their website, or I can introduce you to them here at this church. Carly is serving in our kids' church today, but if you want to be put in contact with her, I'd be happy to just let you meet face-to-face, introduce you to her after the service, so come and see me for that. But not a pretty topic. It's a reality, unfortunately, abuse is in our day and age. But there are some steps that we can take to better navigate it and do some things to prevent it as well. And that's what I want to leave you with today. Let's pray together.